Now, our next app category, the must-have apps that we've been taking you through, is podcasts. Obviously, podcasts have been around for a little while now, since the early 2000s. And as you know, it tends to be episodic audio content to which you can subscribe. They can range anything really from daily podcasts through any time interval you can imagine, through to very occasional ones on any topic under the sun. Really, this is obviously a podcast, so I'm guessing that we've got a level of familiarity with the medium. But they can cover sport, technology, true crime, music, TV shows, spawn podcasts, anything really. You can have dramas broadcast as podcasts. So a rich vein of audio media, which is obviously particularly interesting to blind people. Austin, you suggested, I think, we feature this category this week. It was on the list, obviously. What's your take on podcasts, and what's your podcast client of choice?
I use Pocket Cast to listen to podcasts because one of the benefits of doing that is the pro version of Pocket Cast supports chapter markers. And a lot of podcasts now have chapter markers. So what the chapter markers are, when we produce a podcast, we add markers to the audio so that people can just skip forward to a marker. So like for our podcast, there is a marker for the announcement section. There is a marker for the in focus and the Android basics section, so on. So Pocket Cast Pro supports chapter markers, and there'll be other apps also supporting. So I use Pocket Cast Pro.
What about you, Warren? What's your podcast client of choice?
When it comes to podcast clients, I've been around everywhere. I started though back with Pocket Casts, and then came along. What was that thing from England? I really like that. Now it's just, was it Player FM? Oh gosh, I'm really sorry. The guy would hate me for forgetting his podcast, because he and I work hard on accessibility on that thing. So I think it's Player FM. So I had that. Then I had Castbox. Then I had a bunch of others, but over the time I kind of whittled down, and it's just like Pocket Casts or Google's own podcast client. These are the only two I have left when it's all said and done. So that's what I got. I got the two, and like Austin said, I think for me though, it's not whether I'm able to jump through chapters or any of that, but for me it all comes down to, hey, am I able to just stream it or download it? And I think for me, a good podcast client should offer both, whether you want to download it or you want to simply stream it. And that's why I like both Pocket Cast and the Google client. And also then there's another category that comes in handy on a podcast client. Does it support video? Some do and some don't. And so when you're looking at podcast clients, it's important, if you're into video and all of that, that you make sure that you get one that supports what you're looking for. Because if you don't, then you're going to be disappointed. And I do want to mention here in passing that Pocket Casts does have that video support, and probably one of the very few ones that I know that support video, and that also includes that Player FM. And those two would be my two most important podcast clients. Now, I'm not sure that the Google podcast supports video. I haven't tried it, so I'm not going to be excluding it until I try it. But then, of course, we know that blind people have other ones that they like, just like any other person, sighted or blind. We're not saying, hey, these are the best, because these things are just subjective, and you can't really say, hey, this is the best client. So it depends on the person. If you're one of those that doesn't want to go to a website to listen to a podcast, then you need a podcast client. And these are some of the ones that we're suggesting, not necessarily recommending as being the best podcast clients, but these are the ones that we use.
Mariam, what about you? What do you use as a podcast client?
So I actually use a couple of them. The first one is Google Podcasts, and by the way, it supports video because I'm a long-time user. Also, what I use is not quite often as the Google one, but what I use as well is the TuneIn Radio. Sometimes actually you can have podcasts on it. It's not the best, but some podcasts that I follow actually are uploaded there. So it works. But what I love about the Google Podcast is its fixed flexibility, and I love how the notification plans actually work with the Google Podcast, and how the playback is actually done. I think it's amazing.
Thanks, Marion. I mean, from my part, I really like Podcast Addict. It does support chapter markers. It supports download and streaming. It has a lot of settings. It's quite customizable. So I mean, almost to the extent that the settings can become a little bit overwhelming. It's still in active development. Unlike Google Podcasts, it's not entirely free. There's a version with ads which is free. You can pay to remove ads, and I think they also have some features which are available by a subscription that are particularly server heavy. But do check out Podcast Addict. It's a relatively clean interface. It's not too cluttered. So that's another one that I quite like. Marion touched on something I was going to mention with podcast clients by mentioning TuneIn Radio, and that is that podcast functionality is available through apps that do other things. So Spotify, for instance, allows you to play some podcasts and your music all in one. I don't think it's a particularly feature-rich podcast app, but if all you want to do is find the podcast and play it, and you value the fact that you could have it in the same app as some of your media, if you're a Spotify subscriber, then that might be an option for you. Similarly, Amazon Music also offers some podcast functionality. There are a lot of podcast apps to go at, though. Those are just some of the ones that we quite like.
Talking about settings, Ed, your choice of podcast client, that is the Podcast Addict, would go hand in hand with Pocket Casts, because there's so many settings. It's sometimes a little bit convoluted, and then in Pocket Casts, you also have settings for each podcast. So if you subscribe to different podcasts, you can customize those individually, and it gets overwhelming for someone who's not, all that familiar with that kind of thing. So in reality, I think the most simple podcast client that I have found happens to be that one from Google. It's very simplistic and all of that. So sometimes it's hard to tell a new user, hey, get this one or get that one. But I think it's always good to have something that is simple, that's easy to use. But then as you mature, probably you want to look at feature-rich podcast clients that you may further customize. And this is where clients like Podcast Addict or the Pocket Casts may come in handy. So keep that in mind, play with them, see which one it is that you actually prefer, because it saves you time from having to go to the website, notifies you whenever there's a new episode of the podcast that you're following.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. What one other thing I'd mention, most of the podcast apps have some sort of discover or explore mode where it will recommend podcasts that you might like. Those screens can get relatively cluttered. So I'm not picking on Google Podcasts. It's the same in every app. So if you click on the Explore tab there, you're going to get upwards of 16 different tabs. So you might find yourself wanting to move to the top of the screen quite a bit in some of those in some of those feeds, because there are just so many different podcasts available in so many different categories that those different genres and categories will inevitably take up a fair amount of screen on your app. But normally there are tabs or menu options to get you to a less cluttered interface, and they all tend to have a home area as well. So as you add podcasts, the podcasts that you subscribe to will be kind of front and center on whatever your podcast app has for a home tab.